Oke. Hello, everyone. We're only 14 minutes in, and we have quorum now, finally, so we can actually talk about the things. So today we want to wrap up some of the WinForms discussions from last week. We talked about dark mode, and then the other things we want to talk about invoke async. And God willing, we may have some time left and talk about other issues, but we will find out. Normally, when I say things like this, it does not actually materialize.
Yeah, but now it's your fault.
No, it's my fault. It's always my fault somehow, so that's good. Anybody who has a girlfriend knows that it's always your fault. So then the question is, do you have the delta somewhere posted? I think not, probably, right?
It's not, well, the delta, everything, pretty much everything we changed, but I can quickly go through it and then say what we had before, and then can you refresh your page? I don't know if this is.
It should be the latest. I mean, I just opened it. Yeah. So I mean, the is it in here, or are you looking for something else?
No, it's that is correct. But
yeah. Did you not hit comment on your side? Maybe it's still pending in the text box.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if something else happened since yesterday, but so the last thing that you should see there would be Visual Basic, actually. So that I don't see the whole Visual Basic part in your.
I do not. I mean, this is basically what we approved last time, right? And then if we scroll to the proposal.
Oh, okay. My bad. Okay, so it's the proposal actually that I.
Oh, I see what you're saying. This guy here.
That I updated. Yes. So there's one thing that actually kind of flipped our thinking, because Visual Basic doesn't have like the equivalent to the program.cs.
Right.
So it's Visual Basic and WinForms done via the application framework, and right. And to do the things we introduced, I think back in .NET 5, that was something that Kathleen and I came up. The application defaults, and it's just that every setting that is global to the application is done in the application events in the Visual Basic framework. That's also a methodology that is there since day one in Visual Basic, actually, that you control those things via the application events. And so the additional things then obviously are those what you see here now is the equivalent. So in the apply application default event arcs, which existed before, we add the color mode and the visual styles mode, and then so that we can have project system later have amend those two properties in the framework settings in the UI. We also need them in Windows Forms application base, but it's, practically it's just exposing them the same way as all the other stuff via the Visual Basic application, framework mechanism, if you will. That's the only change, but then Visual Basic becomes a full citizen to be able to consume that. So here's one thing. We went from dark mode to color mode, and the reason is, and it's something that Jeremy pointed out, Windows itself might add additional themings over time, and if we, for like the dark mode settings, which they, by the way, also don't call dark but color mode or color settings. So when they do that, and we would need to pick them up, then dark mode would just no longer work. So we said that color mode is the way to go. Originally, we thought that we also call that enum now color mode. The problem is that collides with the color mode in imaging that we already have, and that I only realized yesterday evening. So I thought that system color mode was a better way to distinguish between that color mode, and I mean they're both in separate namespaces, so they wouldn't really collide technically, but I think it's just confusing. And system color, since we're talking about system colors, I think that system color mode also makes sense, and then it's like immediately clear. So those are the changes we did there, and I mean it doesn't change anything in what we talked about. It's just the naming, but the approach is identical.
Okay, so I was just looking at I was translating this into a language I actually speak, aka C#. So mostly because my tools don't pick up VB right now. So if we post it as VB, then bad things are going to happen. So my understanding is, looking at the way these things are exposed right now, is that the properties on WinForms application base would be get set and would be marked as editor browsable never, because all the other ones are also marked editor browsable never. And then the ones on the event arcs are also get and set, and they are not marked with anything special. Is that correct?
That is correct, because they need to be, like in the screenshots above, you see them, they're actually used then. So you would go into the application events, and then you would, from the drop down menu in the editor, you would pick like my application events. Then you can pick the event. Then the editor would automatically hook up the apply application defaults event with the handles clause in Visual Basic, and then you would apply your settings by setting the right properties in the event arcs. And of course, that is then something they would A, see, and B, should be sufficiently documented so people know what it's about.
And the properties on the application base, they are just infrastructure, right? They're not expected to be used by users at all, right? Which is why you mark them as editor browsable state never.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But they shouldn't be seen. So they're part of the code generation later. So what happens right now in the application framework is that we have a file that gets written at the moment. The file is this application.myapp file inside of the properties folder, which is hidden by default. So this is all the black boxish thing that Visual Basic unfortunately still does. And the moment it gets written, like a legacy code generator runs, doesn't have to do anything with Roslyn, and then generates those. But also the whole Visual Basic compiler is a little bit of a black box when it comes to application framework. So it's injecting parts of the code. Yeah, let's not go into this. So it's just the way it worked. It always worked. At one point, we want to migrate the application framework setup so that it becomes compatible to C#, so that we don't have no longer two kind of places where we in Visual Basic now don't really know what the source of truth is, because we have this application.myapp file which like dictates what's get code generated, but at the same time in C# we also have the project settings, which are like the native WinForms project settings, which then also get code generated by Roslyn into C# via like Roslyn code generators. And I talked to Melissa from the project system team, and we said that at one point in the .NET Tame framework, we want to migrate those so that the old code generator in Visual Basic goes away, and then it's just one place we have to maintain. That's the idea behind it.
And then presumably they also all marked experimental, right? Because they're like the rest of the dark mode stuff.
Oh
right?
yes, yeah, I did that already. Sorry, that that everything that we talk about today will be attributed experimental. Yes.
And then, so the proposal you have here right now, like, is also different from what we approved last time, right? Like, so we ended up with not having the
we didn't discuss
there,
actually.
right?
Exactly. So, and that is something that I added now. When you go back to the So those things before the Visual Basic screenshots, that's the scroll down until you find the a little bit down more, a little bit down. And so, okay. So yeah, so that was the part where we said, do we want to have a version, or do we not have a version? So that was my original implementation. And then, both of you, we talked and we said, well, maybe we don't want to have a version. And then Jeremy said last time, and we pointed out last time that, that's going to be difficult if I want to then opt into some of and that was my concern as well. If I need to rely, for example, if I have built upon a control that is existing at the time, and I had built up a library on that specific implementation of the control, how would I then control that if I cannot opt into a specific version? And so with that, I could do that. And my idea, so part of the original idea was that we would add version numbers for every long-term .NET version, so that we would have like .NET 10, .NET 12, and so on. I wouldn't. So one of the ideas that I wouldn't like to include the other versions is most of all .NET 9 because of the sorting. It would be really nice to start with .NET 10, and also everything here is targeting actually .NET 10 because everything is experimental. So we have 10, 12, and so on, and no single-digit version numbers. The sorting would be okay then.
So yeah, I mean, I don't have any strong opinions in this space. Like, you kind of have to decide what is acceptable complexity-wise. If you think you have scenarios for that, then I guess that's the way it is.
I mean, the normal case would then be, if you would opt into it, you would ideally just use latest. So whatever version you have, you will have latest. But because of the accessibility requirements that are coming up for have to be implemented, I think in July 2025 at the latest, there will be changes to how much real estate controls are consuming. Like, if you remember, the up-down controls in WinForms have this really tiny little up and down buttons, and those are obviously off the table. So that is something that we need to go in and redesign, and they need more real estate. So which means that the layouts also will change. But that's something that we just need to also tell our audience, that the classic pixel perfect design of WinForms apps is not like as straightforward as it was before, because first we need to include things like different high DPI modes. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that the controls will just need more real estate, and so people just should use table layout panels, flow layout panels, and stuff like that more. But that's more than the support of the designer that needs to come to help people to mitigate to that, or to migrate to that. Yes. And that we need to change the layout of controls is nothing new. So for example, in Windows 11, the Windows team introduced the focus indicator, like this blue line in the text box for Win32 controls. They're like 3 pixels higher, or 4 pixels higher even than they used to be in the XP themes, which, by the way, is a little bit of a problem for us in the designer right now, because also the baselines, then these blue positioning lines, have to change. So that is something where we probably would need just one other new API, which is just designer support, which just puts the calculation of that baseline into the control, because that's actually where it's supposed to be while it's now in the designer. We cannot have 14 versions of the designer depending on what the Windows team does with the different real estate demands or requirements for control.
Right.
That shouldn't be scope of that. It's just a little bit of the background here.
So just looking at the API proposal that you have here, that's substantially different from what we approved last week. So is the intent that everything here is the change you want to see, or is it to just update part of it?
Well, actually, so it's not fundamentally differently. The one thing that we said is that for dark mode, we throw out everything that is on control. So there's one thing that we needed to keep at control, and that is we need to be able to control if the theming, the dark theming, gets applied to a control or not automatically. Because there are controls when you try to apply the theming, then they pretty much explode. So that needs to be an opt-in. So that means we don't have something where we override that or a method, but we just add this apply theming implicitly to the already existing styles in WinForms. So that's just an enum that we are adding and that we are internally using. So if your control says apply theming implicitly, then you get dark moded. And if not, then not. And so it's an opt-in. It's to be really backwards compatible.
Well,
that's one thing. That,
I guess apply theming implicitly means you inherit it from the container, right? Is that what it means? So if the container says light mode, then you will still get light mode, right?
I mean, we don't have. So we decided last time that we have either light mode or dark mode. So that doesn't have anything with the container now. So if the app is in dark mode, then it's dark mode. If it's in light mode, it's light mode. And otherwise, the changes that we now did in the system colors wouldn't work, because then we would have a mixture. If we would change the system colors in the middle of the deployment of the controls, then half of the controls could be white and half of the controls could be dark mode styled, and then that wouldn't make that would be even dangerous. And so no, I mean, it's the same that we have now. If you put the whole system into high contrast mode, the exact same thing happens, and it happens today. It's just that every control will then, or needs, doesn't always, but it's supposed to show everything in that high contrast mode. So principally, there's nothing new. It's just that we just throw out, as we discussed it, everything on control, so that it's either on or off, depending on what you set up from the application. But still, on the control level, we just have to have a way to say, no, this control needs to style itself completely by itself. This has nothing to do with the classic Windows styles, with the theming rather. Leave it alone. Don't send any messages to it. It will do it itself. And so that is something where we need a little bit control on control level, and that is the thing. And as I said, it's an opt-in. So every control that wants to get dark mode style needs to, by the system, needs to say, hey, I want to. And then it sets that style. Otherwise, it doesn't mean it cannot show dark mode. It's just saying then, if you don't opt in that, then you're on your own. You have to make sure that the colors you're getting are displayed in the correct way. That's all. And so, yeah, that's basically the change that we did. We renamed a couple of things because dark mode wouldn't work. Color mode would not work because of the existing color mode that we have in Imaging. But other than that, the principle is completely the same. And yeah.
And then I guess one question I had is you have two different diagnostic IDs. You have WFO 9001 and you have WFO 9000. What's the difference between the two?
So one is dark mode, one is visual styles.
Gotcha.
And there's then the third one. But I mean, yeah, the third one will then be, you know, everything around async. I mean, my idea was that we differentiate between them. If you say, well, you know what, let's just have one, I'm fine with that. That was, I mean, that's something that we can change.
I mean, that's up to you.
So,
like, as long as you, I mean, the only thing I would make sure is you generally want things that are logically one. So the one thing to consider is every diagnostic you have here is something that the user has to suppress separately, right? So if you have two, that means if you want to use just the theming part, you have to suppress one of them. If you use just the visual styles thing, you only have to suppress one of them. If you need both, then you just have to suppress both of them, right? So if you think of them as independent features and they can be used independently, then having two separate diagnostics makes sense. If you can't really use them independently, I don't think it makes sense to have two separate diagnostics, because then everybody has to suppress both of them.
You absolutely can. I mean, you can have dark mode and don't touch the visual styles. You just can have visual styles and don't touch the dark mode, and then you can have obviously async. I mean, for modernization of an app, then yes, surely they have to do with each other, because they, you know, the scenarios that you are targeting will meet all three areas of them, but pretty much, yeah. I mean, and we introduced also analyzers now for Visual Basic, like around securities. And so if you're wondering why is this, you know, starting with 9,000 and not with 1, I mean, I'm German, I need number groups. and so that is something that I think is just clearer. So we have, you know, we're starting, I think, with zeros. Everything is everything around that we had is starting with 0. Then we have a couple of security analyzers where we make sure that the binary serializer, for example, is not get fed, or well, right. And we avoid serialization of properties and stuff like that by analyzers and other things. Those should be then in another number group. And then we have the convenience features that we want to add over time, and that would be the third number group. That was the idea behind it.
Yeah, the number groups are fine. I think that's more like how you want to organize it. I mean, the compiler has that as well. I think we also do that. The only thing I'd say is don't introduce multiple prefixes, right? I think everything you have is WFO right now.
Everything is WFO. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense then. Yeah, I mean, I'm at the point now, because we are like release cycle wise so close to finish line, and everything you add is experimental. I still have some questions, but I think most of my questions are nothing you can answer right now. It has to do with how does it work with WPF, for example, which I think we already collectively decided we want to solve later anyway. So I would, you know, I don't know the feature well enough, but like I think what you have, at least superficially, looks to me like it might work. So, I mean, that's basically the bar at this point, right? You want to have a feature that you can give to people. People can use it. They give you feedback, and then, you know, all the complexity and interactions, both with third parties as well as with WPF, I think is one of those things you just have to try it for a while and actually see what the corner cases are. And given that we don't have that data today, I don't think it makes a lot of sense trying to review that.
And also, just so you know, so I was able to actually implement the changes already and see if they are working out. So this is nothing theoretical, but I already tested that. So we had a couple of demos for the last conferences that I demoed, and I refactored them already to see, are they still working the same way? And yes, they do. I tested both Visual Basic and C#. So at this point, I'm pretty confident that when we can merge that not, you know, everything explodes the moment you switch it on.
The only question I have is, so on the C# side with WinForms, I think I understand well enough how that works. I don't understand the VB side well enough. So based on the code that you showed, my understanding is that the WinForms application based thing is entirely used by, as you said, the legacy code generator for VB that spits out some VB code that then gets linked with the app, right?
Yeah, so that doesn't work at the moment. So that doesn't work at the moment. So we have no UI for that, because that only makes sense when we say, okay, this is the way to go. It's no longer experimental. Then I can make the changes in project system so that the UI actually is there. And only if the UI is there, it makes sense to feed the code generator and then have the code.
But then the apply application defaults event args, that's kind of the thing that the user writes in their own code, right? They intercept the event and then they literally have a line that says, e dot color mode equals blah, right?
It's pretty much as I showed in the screenshot that you saw before. So they're like the two alternatives that you have in the Visual Basic Application Framework is define those settings over the UI,
right?
In the classic way, and then it gets code generated, and you don't need to touch the application events,
right?
Or, and that was always the alternative option, you do it in the application events, you leave the UI alone, and then you can do everything programmatically.
Yeah.
So at the moment.
So the reason I'm asking is basically, so my only concern is if there is a UI in VB where you can configure this, and then there is some secret code generation, whether the user actually gets the warning that they're using an experimental feature, right? If they always get one and they have to suppress it, I think it's fine. But the thing you want to avoid is that you have a different entry point that kind of bypasses the whole experimental thing, and then they don't realize that they are.
That's why you at the moment can only do it, as long as it is experimental, we can only do it via the application events, and that's why they explicitly excluded it. That it won't be generate that particular code, and therefore it won't show up with the experimental feature.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So the only real change then that we did was throwing out everything dark mode on control level. But that was actually the result of the discussion. We renamed the enums. And then the other thing was just the version number in the visual styles, but also the visual styles itself. I reordered them, but I think that was also something that we talked about, so that 0 now are really the default value. So if you don't set anything, everything is classic, or so that if you don't say anything, everything is as before. So you have to opt into everything. And honestly, I would like even for .NET 10 to have it that way, because it's just safer.
Right.
And it's only one line of code that you would need to add, or even then, if we have like the project system reflect the new settings, you just go into the project properties editor and just set the flag or set the feature.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still not entirely sure on the versioning scheme you have there, but I think we can probably defer that to later. One thing I'll say is, because the way you named it, Net 1.0, the problem is I've seen this used a lot to refer to .NET Framework 1.0. So we solved this in the project file by saying we put a period nowadays. So when you target .NET 10, it would look like target framework net 1.0 period 0, right? So in which case it's clear that it's 10.0 and not 1.0. But I can see people being confused by that. But I also don't have great ideas on how to solve it, because, well, there really isn't a way to put a period in an enum name. But we can solve that at a later stage, I think. Jeremy?
I mean, I would prefer if we had like version you set somewhere, if you were opting into stuff, like what's your min bar, like actually using version. Is that something that's like, do you have any prior art for or guidance?
I mean, I will generally say the problem is that you have a versioning is you want to avoid, independent axes as much as possible because they explode very quickly, right? So if you have one global version for the process, that's very easy. If you have one version per control, well then I don't even know how you reason about your control tree at some point, right? Because then you have all these conflicting versions.
And but that sort of goes with the other stuff as well, right? I mean, if we have a separate flag for every control, it would still be the same, right?
I mean, yeah, I agree with that. I think the thing with modes is that modes are not great, but I think the challenge that you have with version numbers is you kind of have to define where they come from and like what it means, kind of thing. But if you say 11.0, like what features are tied to 11.0, right? But in some sense, there's also the strength, right? Because it means if you add more features, well, you can just book them under existing version numbers or new version numbers, and then you don't have to check like 1,200 things independently, right? So like we did this for OS functionality, where we basically said, screw this. There's an OS version behind OS APIs, and so you just query the OS version rather than checking each and every API whether it's available, which is what Windows wants us to do, but that just explodes very badly. So I think in your case, like I think the trade-off is like, versions are hard. You have to have a decoder ring somewhere to tell people what is mapped to it. The benefit though is that you don't have like, a grab bag of independent on-off switches, right? So, I mean, I don't have strong opinions because I mean, your design here kind of like presupposes like a world where you have like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those things, right? And then, you want to set yourself up for success there. I don't understand enough like what are the implications of setting those, right? So that's why we don't really have prior art for that. I think the prior art that we have is we have obviously the app context switches, which are just booleans, right? On-off switches kind of thing. And then we have the .NET Framework quirk behavior that we had for a while, where we differentiate based on what your app was compiled for rather than what your app is running on, right? And then the other thing we have is the OS thing, right, where we have this supported OS platform version where an analyzer basically checks whether you checked for those, right? But then that's kind of the only things that are similar to what you have here, I think. But my understanding is you want to live in a world where the person is targeting the latest version of .NET, so they're building for .NET 10, let's say, but then they want to basically on some controls put them in some sort of legacy mode so they render like better, right?
And so one thing that I want to point out also is that this is only affecting the like how does it look and how much space does it take. That's the only thing. The principal behavior should be always backwards compatible, and so it's not that we have like a different version, a complete different version of the control. I mean, there are like historically, if you take a look at the rich text box, for example, there were really big changes in it, obviously, over the time. I mean, that's something that is as it is, and you cannot really target it in a good way. But I mean, that's rather the exception.
I mean, that's kind of the discussion I had with Klaus. Like, to some extent, you control your own destiny here because you own the framework, so you get to set the rules. Like, the general trade-off is every time you give people a quirk that can opt out on a per object instance basis, basically, the number of states that can appear in your app are growing quickly, right? So the question is, like, if you just say screw it, if you target .NET 10, that's the behavior you get, and if your controls don't look right, well, you have to fix them, right? That's a decision you can take. Now, I understand that has other problems, but I'm saying that, all of those decisions are basically determining what ecosystem you're getting, right? And the more kind of knobs you give people, the more complexity you have in terms of number of supported configurations, right? And that might be harder to reason about in the long run, right? So that's why, you could reasonably say, well, there's new behaviors that come with accessibility and other things, and the expectation is if your app targets a newer version of .NET, well, they will use those, and you generally don't have a way to opt out from those, right?
I mean, and then the other point is that this is all purely driven by accessibility. It's not, I mean, this is what we explicitly said. We don't want to introduce theming. We don't, want to, be the competitors to that. our third parties do a way better job in really pretty styling and theming and everything,
Right.
and we don't want to go there. But there are like requirements as minimum real estate of how big a control has to be and stuff like that, and we need to make changes to contrast or something like that, and our high DPI demands. I mean, a 1 pixel thick line is barely visible in certain circumstances but that is what we had before when we drew borders. So those things we need to be able to change, but not because we want to be pretty, just because we want to be like compliant. And so
yeah, I'm not saying the changes are bad, right? All I'm saying is that I think you get to decide how to roll them out, right? Like whether you force people to upgrade or whether you just allow them to set them in legacy mode, right?
The argument I'm saying is that we should really use this then also in a very like limited form. I mean, do the necessary thing so that we match compliance, but that's it. But still, there might be things where people want to opt out on a version base, and I think that is the shouldn't be getting too complicated over time, because the changes that we will do in WinForms should be only necessary, but not because of we want to have a very fancy way to do it. I mean, if we have to touch it, it shouldn't look like a sack of cells, as we say in German. But
right.
yeah.
I mean, the other thing I said, similar to what I said about dark mode, is it seems like the kind of stuff where it would make. I mean, I understand the WPF and WinUI have mostly dynamic layout anyway, in which case when things grow and shrink, the layout can generally absorb this. But I guess they have similar problems at some point where the OS does changes or accessibility features come in that change how things are being done. And I guess it would be nice if we don't have like one way to do it in WinUI, one way to do it in WPF, and another way to do it in WinForms, right? So if we, for example, have it's not so much the naming of the API, it's also like where do you set those configurations, right? So for example, it would be bad if in WinForms you do it via a project level setting that is then code-gen into the app, and then in WinUI you have a callback, and in WPF you do something in XAML, right? That would be unfortunate, right? So I feel like if we because again, especially when you consider that things are hosted in each other, you somehow want some sort of consistency between those, and so you kind of want to like have some sort of similarity there, I guess, in the approach. Which again, we are very late for this, but I guess that will be one way to also drive the design and say, okay, what are we doing in WinUI? What are you doing in WPF for those things? And what is the philosophy that makes sense for all of them, right? So in that sense, yeah, I think I'm okay with improving the API as is, given that everything's experimental. And then, we probably have to change it substantially anyway at this point. So, it seems reasonable. I assume nobody has a problem with that on people on the call. Not everybody shout at once.
I heard nothing I disagreed with.
Yeah, so I copy pasted. Of course, now there's one comma missing, which fucks up everything in GitHub. Yeah, it's basically copy paste what you have above, and then the other thing I did is the very end. This is the VB stuff. Yeah, if the diagnostics are wrong, just change them to whatever you want to change them. Then, like, to me, the more important thing is the prefix. Since we already agreed on the prefix, I don't actually care what the number is. I also don't care how many you have, right? So long you keep in mind that every one of them is a suppression the user has to take.
Yeah. But I mean, we had the discussion with Kathleen also, and she was fine with it. So
yeah,
everybody was included in the general. What's the prefix for WinForms?
Yep. All right, then we're done with this one. That was a quick one, only 50 minutes. Um, so then the async one here.
Yeah, those are some of the samples I did, and this is basically the motivation behind that is actually two things. So for the invoke async on control, those are necessary if we. So for example, I had the concrete case where I needed to use the web view, and I needed to invoke a method of the web view asynchronously that had also at the same time be marshaled to the UI thread. I think it was navigate to on the web view or something. So when I tried to do that, not on the UI thread, then it would the web view would explode. And there are a couple of other things when you use projection from the Windows APIs into WinForms that are obviously async. Also need to be marshaled to the UI thread at the same time, and so that is something that we more got asked by first and third parties, also by customers, and that would be basically mitigating it. And what I would feed the call are either an action, a function or a func, or then a function of task. And if it's a task, then that task would also be awaited inside of the invoke mechanism. So under the covers pretty much is using begin invoke and task completion source, so that the exception gets what's the right term, propagated correctly into back to the caller. And yeah, that's like a couple of overloads, and that's basically it.
Does C# pick the right overload? Like, I'm assuming we tested it when you have like a task of T and a T result. If it's a task, it will pick the task one.
So, I mean, I've tested it in a couple of things, and yes, I wouldn't find any problems with that. I have to say though, we did have problems with Visual Basic back with invoke already, and that is something that I need to revisit. So when I think it was 2 versions back, we introduced an overload for invoke that could also accept an action rather than a pure delegate. The problem with Visual Basic is that Visual Basic automatically generates the right code and resolves that, and now it is an ambiguous call, so that really no longer works, and broke it in a way. So there's a little bit of testing that I have to do, and I'm also not sure how to deal with that existing thing. So with the invoke, but yeah, but principally that I tested that, and for C#, it is okay so far. For Visual Basic, as I said, I need to figure out what we do with the existing problem we already have.
So my assumption here is that the reason why you have both sync and async versions of the delegate that you pass to invoke async is that the value of invoke async is mostly that you wait for the completion of this thing while pumping messages, right? But whether the action that runs on the UI thread is synchronous or asynchronous is completely orthogonal to this, right? Is that fair?
Yeah. So for example, I would also use it. I mean, the other method could probably a little bit mitigate that, but right now, I'm also using begin invoke. Not if I want to, just purely delegate it to the UI thread. I would also do that if I want just to kick something off that would otherwise look really bad. So if, for example, if you have a form that is really a complex form and it takes a while to run initialize component, and you are doing that from, you're calling that form from another form load, for example, then as long as that thing runs, obviously that form hangs then the whole UI thread when you, just because of the show method. And since everything has to run on the UI thread, there is a point where that needs to be, like blocked. But it's the moment of time that makes it either look good or bad. So if one form has just, is just in the progress of getting deployed, and you're like in a state where half of the controls are already visible on the screen, and some colors are set and some colors are not, and then there comes a call to something else, because the event queue is like at that point, what should you do? If you then don't fire the other thing off asynchronously, you will just block it at that unfortunate moment, and then you will really see a bad state. And if you then just call that with begin invoke, that is mitigating that. But then you have to do all the handling of that and the exception handling and everything, and so that's the motivation behind it also. So I'm using this not only for putting things back on the UI thread, but also to do it to resolve any visual short hangs. It's not a classic hang, just to make things more fluent when you see it on the screen or when it's set up.
Then I have a question for Stephen and Jeremy. So what is with the cancellation token for the cases where there's an async delegate? Should that also take a cancellation token, or is the expectation that you just capture the other cancellation token if you want to cancel the operation itself, or what's the expectation there?
Looks like Tobe dropped. I mean, one would hope to the same cancellation token. I think probably the answer is if you want them to be different, then you'll have already, the one that's inside, you'll have to pre-bind the cancellation token to. You'll have to figure out a way to smuggle your cancellation token inside, which is doable. Just harder. But it's why when we did async enumerable, we didn't end up with 7 cancellation token parameters.
Yeah, and then some of the methods, I know we have the state object thing, right? Or state T as well, if you want to avoid an allocation for the delegate itself, but that may be premature here. I'm not sure how much. I mean, I would hope these are not the methods that you invoke in a hot path.
Tobe's back. He can answer the question now. Sorry, what was the question?
So the question is, for these cases where you have invoke async that takes a delegate that basically returns a task, is also an async delegate in that sense, is the guidance that these should also accept the cancellation token, or would the expectation be that the cancellation token that the outer invoker gets is basically captured by the delegate?
You generally want the delegate to also take a cancellation token.
And then what is your threshold for also accepting either an object state or a T?
Depends on, sorry, one second. Yes, it depends on how high performance the library needs to be. You generally do it for a cancellation token because you want the outer invoker to be able to substitute its own token, like wrap the provided cancellation token with one of its own so that it can add its own timeout, or it's it might want to be able to cancel it for additional reasons beyond the one that was passed in. Separate state is generally opaque to the wrapper delegate. So whether you would do that would be purely a performance decision on whether you need to avoid a closure in order to get that state passed in.
Right. Yeah, that's where, I mean, I have a hard time imagining that you would do invoke async in a case where allocations would matter. I would generally assume you do it for things where you already allocate a ton of shit, right? Like you already are doing things like, you're building up a form or something else where the additional allocation of the closure is not the thing that's going to kill you. The whole point of doing an invoke async here is not to make things faster, right? It's just to pump messages so that the UI doesn't freeze, right? That's more or less.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you don't use invoke async in like something like a loop. So when you, for example, if you try to animate something in a control, I mean, there's an example also where we're actually doing that. I mean, it's just a little demo, but if you scroll up a little bit, that was something that I wrote the Spiral thing to see that you can really, acquire a graphics object in WinForms, and as long as the handle for the control that is that gets rendered on exists, then every task can actually have its own graphics handle acquired, and then if you set the clipping region for that graphics then appropriately, then you can really, from every task without putting it back to the UI thread, render into that thing.
But even in that case, if you're literally talking about a loop that's calling invoke async, there's nothing that requires that to allocate per call.
Oh, that's true.
For the closure. The closure can be once for the containing call.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, the argument against it is just the explosion of either to make it more awkward to pass in a very simple action that doesn't take anything, because everybody has to now do the discard for the state, right? Or you end up with multiple overloads, right? So
yeah,
it's kind
of
in
the case of,
you're gonna want one that doesn't have the state, regardless, for the very reason that Nemo just said, and not even for the delegate side of it, but if you actually don't have any state to pass in, you're forced to provide state as an argument for the function. So you end up like having to pass in some dummy true or zero or something, in which case you really kind of want an overload that doesn't have state, at which point you can just have the one that doesn't have state and then only add the one that takes state as a new overload, should you actually get performance data suggesting the lack of that is problematic.
Yeah, I would be supportive of that. And then my last question is, so I understand the invoke async thing, but I have no idea what this has to do with show dialog async.
So show dialog async and also show async is so first the show async is one of the cases that I already described. So when you really want to pretty much await a form until it is closed. So it means it's like, think of you have a form load, and then you have a loop, and then you build up the two windows that you have in your WinForms app. You can just asynchronously keep looping inside of form load, and have a like task array with all your two windows, and then you wait for any of the tasks to be finished, and with that you can, like, in a really typical async easy way, just control your two windows in that way, and also you have then the advantage. So if you show a form with show async, then it's automatically also queued. So the call to show the actual form is also queued into the message pump rather than that we are waiting for the show to succeed, which means if the form is really a big one, the call returns immediately rather than you have to wait for everything to be set up. And so that contributes to the fluent kind of UIs. And then thirdly, if you want to share, so we did a couple of enhancements to the data binding. For example, we can now, since .NET 7, we can do command binding in WinForms, as you know. So when you then have like something like an UI service where you would like to migrate your app or parts of your app in WinForms away to, let's say, Maui or WinUI, then the UI service should be compatible or easy make compatible to what you have. And since everything is async in WinUI and Maui, so it's like I don't know, content dialog show async or pop-up show async, everything is also async, then it's just easier to adapt a UI service than to also WinForms, because the approach is then pretty much the same in all UI stacks.
Right.
Like a couple of advantages to do that, and that's the thought behind it.
So what about I have my notes here. So what about message box and what about common file dialogues? They don't get it, the show dialog async?
So we thought about message box, and the first proposal was actually message box, but we want to make sure that the task dialog, which is the modern version of the message box, is like preferred over the conventional one. That's why we thought we do it only with the task dialog.
I mean, file open, file save seems like reasonable as well, right? No?
That's true. Actually, yeah, you're right. And I haven't thought about that.
And then the other question I had is, so what does it mean to cancel a show dialog? What exactly happens?
So when you are, I mean, it's a while ago since I implemented that, so I should need to look that up. If I remember correctly, that a canceling of the dialog is I think a close request in that case. If it is a show dialog and I have to look that up too. So I'm not sure enough to answer that right now. Yeah,
Because
sorry.
the question really is cancellation meaningful? Because if you're taking a cancellation token and it doesn't really do anything, then maybe you shouldn't take one, though we can have that debate. But if it is meaningful, then obviously you should take it.
If I remember correctly, in the case of form.show, it is. In the case of so I'm pretty sure in the case of the task dialog, it also is, because that one can be canceled from the outside. A message box would not be meaningful because there were no means to cancel it, but I'm pretty sure that both form and form show async and task dialog are canceled by the cancellation token. Yes, they can be canceled from the outside, so to say.
And then the behavior is I call show dialog async, and then it throws an exception, tasks cancel exception, basically. Is that what the caller observes?
Well, no, I think in that case, canceling would close the form or close the task dialog.
And so I actually get the whatever the task
I'm
dialog
certain-
button cancel is. Is that the behavior?
I'm wondering if this is really something that cancellation token is appropriate for.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the idea of being passed something that can tear down a bunch of stuff and have that include, sort of automatically include UI elements, seems like it could be disruptive to the user. And while I don't disparage the idea of having the application be able to close a dialogue without the user interacting with it, having that be the same cancellation token that's interrupting other work seems like it could be a can of worms. Like people will accidentally pass that token into these dialogues when they didn't really mean to do so. And if it actually isn't resulting in exceptions being thrown, then it's kind of not modeling what cancellation token is often used to model.
Yeah,
This really
that's
seems
true.
to be a cute way of exposing a close without having to expose a close.
It also seems weird to me in the sense that, you know, when you, I'm not entirely sure task dialog works 100%, but you said it doesn't work for message box, but I mean, they're both similar. They both have an X in the top right corner, right? But you get to control whether the X shows based on which buttons you allow, right? So for example, if you have a message box that has yes, no, but no cancel button, it would be very weird if I then get a cancel result, even though cancel wasn't the button that was there in the first place, which I think is also true for task dialog, right? You can have a task dialog that just has two buttons, you know, let's say yes, no, and there's no cancel, and now suddenly you give me back a value that wasn't there as a result
And
of
then-
me canceling the dialogue.
Then I mean, on the other side, I mean, I'm not generally argue against that, but on the other side, there were like I had numerous cases in Visual Studio of all apps where I would love to have for the method that called a modal dialog the ability to just, you know, erase it from the screen again so that Visual Studio becomes responsive again. And when the modal dialog is on the screen, then it's just blocking everything else.
So I think that's the part where I think we're kind of in agreement that it would be nice to have, but it seems like the problem with cancellation token is, right? So if you look at, let's say you have some sort of code where you have a method, in the method you have task dialog, show dialog async. That method that does the invocation also happens to get a cancellation token. Now,
Yes.
use ReSharper
Yeah.
or use something else that tells you like, oh yeah, there's a cancellation token, you should pass it in there. And then you're suddenly in the situation that Stephen described, where basically you cancel something
That's
that is
true.
meant to be a background operation, all of a sudden UI disappears, right? And it's like, well, was that what you meant? Especially when then this doesn't throw an exception, because now, you know, I think to me the problem is like cancellation usually means work is incomplete, so you can't really continue. Like I consider this failed kind of thing, right? Which is more or less what exceptions are meant to communicate. But now you're basically saying, no, you return a result. The result is the dialog was canceled, which may or may not be meaningful depending on, I guess for forms it kind of always is, because that's how forms work. But I feel for task dialog, given similar to message box that you control which buttons are there, you kind of inject it in an alternate state now, which seems like a bug farm, like, because I think people probably don't handle that state, would be my guess.
That's agree. Also, I mean, if you want to have it, a form is usually inherited from the base form anyway. So if you really want to have that overload, then you can still implement it yourself and then, you know, react to it accordingly. So there wouldn't be a problem. So yeah, I agree. I would, yeah, let's not do that then rather.
And I'm still not 100% sure I understand like what you said, because I mean, my understanding is the way modal dialogues work in Windows is, yeah, the call is blocking, but because the thing you're calling is effectively creating another message pump, like UI doesn't freeze up, right? The caller, like, it's not that the calling form is suddenly frozen, right? So like whatever paint events you're handling, you still get those, right? So I'm still not entirely sure I understand like what, I mean, in invoke async I understand, because you dispatch to the main thread, and so that other thread is now blocked, right? Which, you know, with async wouldn't be the case. But given that you have to call show dialog from the main thread already, and you are now in a state where the other receiver is still logically pumping the same message loop, I don't understand where you free up resources. Like I don't quite get that part.
I mean, in why? So why do we need to have a show?
Yeah,
async
I still don't understand what
to
the
begin
show
with?
dialog async does. But then your example was, well, it's useful not for asynchronicity as much as it is for the aggregating of the results if you show multiple things, right? But they, like, if you
But
let's
that
say you
wouldn't work.
launched like 12 tool
No,
windows, right?
I mean,
They're all still on the
yeah.
on the same thread, right? They're not.
Well, yeah, but that would only be true for show async, not for show dialog async, because show dialog async, you cannot like have 3 or 4 modal dialogues at the same time, so that wouldn't make sense in that case.
But
No,
that's
that-
true too.
that-
Yeah.
the-
Yeah.
the show dialog async is mostly driven by being compatible to the other UI frameworks, so that a UI service would have the same signature and can be applied easily, throughout those. And that's basically the primary idea behind that for the show dialog async.
But I guess my question is, what does your implementation do? I mean, do you just return basically a task from result, or is there a task? What's it called? Task completion source involved somewhere? Like I still don't get where the like. What are you doing that is not effectively just blocking the thread? I guess is my question. Because I mean, the underlying Windows APIs for a message box, there is no async version, right? It's a blocking call, right?
But I think the other UI stacks are doing pretty much the same there, right? I mean, it's also like a blocking dialog from the user's perspective, but you call it asynchronously, and it's not. I mean, it's not always.
I guess that's the part I don't understand. Like, it's like there's no task.run involved, right? Because you clearly have to be on the UI thread to issue the call to, the Win32 show dialog API, right? So yeah. I don't understand where, and the calling code for this one also is on the UI thread, right? So I don't understand where there is any, like, you are fundamentally on the same thread on both sides of this. So that's why I'm.
What I mean, the one advantage that you have again is what I mentioned earlier, that the way it is implemented is that it returns immediately, and you await also the part where the form is set up. So that means that, in contrast to just the show dialog, where it's blocking also the message queue until it has its own message queue. Does it make sense?
That's the part where I'm slightly confused, because that's the magic of Win32, right? Because when you do show dialog, like, yes, you basically block the call, but like the other one is still pumping the messages for you, right? So
yeah, but I mean, it only, so I mean, yes, but there is the time between the call and when the second message pump is starting, and that time is depending on how complex the form is that you are going to show. And I have to confess, in the case of just a task dialog or a message box, that is you can dismiss that because it's like milliseconds probably. But for the form.show dialog async, that's a different thing, because if you have a really complex form, then until the form gets its own message queue, the call is blocking the calling UI thread, and only then the message queue of the caller is continued to pump. So let's say you have a form and initialized component. You have a thread sleep 2000.
Mm-hmm.
Then you would actually hang the program with a show dialog for 2 seconds visibly before it would continue. If you called it with show dialog async, it would still hang, but you wouldn't notice it from the calling thread.
I see. So basically So, but then in this case, so I guess when you have a form, right? So basically what you're saying is the constructor runs, and then the constructor calls initialized components. So the call of initialized components plus the constructor is needs to complete before the next message loop is actually pumping messages, right? So that's the thing.
Not only initialize components, everything until pretty much. I mean, that's now Jeremy's specialty. I would say everything until create handle is actually called. There's tons of things that needs to be done, and the more controls you set up inside of initialize component, the more it takes until the form is actually in the state where it can start pumping on its own message queue.
But then, are you saying that when you call show async now, does that now mean that the constructor and the initialize component is running on a worker thread, and you're like
No. That's not the point. The point is that you defer the point of time when the constructor runs. When you have a UI, and it is, and you, let's say you show the dialog, and then at an unfortunate point where you're still setting up something in your own UI, then that leads to this typically like you have half of something drawn already, and then you're holding. That's the nature of WinForms and also the other UI stacks, that those things need to run on the UI thing. But the parts that look ugly are those parts where you just show or do things at the wrong time. And with async, you can just queue it to the message pump after everything that is already being queued, and that makes it then look way more fluent than before. Does that make sense?
Naive question. Is it guaranteed to actually be a FIFO queue? I don't know the answer. Maybe it is. Or is it possible I could queue 6 things and they run out of order from how I queued them?
Oh, I mean, I can only tell you from like experience that doing it that way always almost always solved the problems. But Germany
or messages.
Yeah.
Are you saying, Stephen? Yeah. Or so Windows
I'm
messages?
Asking about messages. Yeah, are they always processed in the order in which I queue them?
That's a good question. Always is a difficult thing to answer. Certainly what we queue on our own, that like our work items for the callbacks, it's a single, we're pulling that from a queue. So anything that you're going to queue is going to come in the same order. But Windows messages in general. I'm just questioning
because Klaus said that one of the primary benefits of this is being able to put something in line to execute after everything you've already done. And I just wanted to make sure that would actually come to fruition.
I think that's generally true. Because, I mean, if you want something to go right away, I mean, you just send it. You don't queue it. Right? And that's just a direct call back to the WinProc or whatever thing doesn't go into the queue. I don't know if they have any special handling for specific things, but I can't say that with 100% confidence that they don't ever throw some message.
But you're not concerned that it's for this purpose, even if it wasn't 100%, it'd be good enough that it's 95%.
Yeah, that's my understanding. It's just, I mean, that world is full of special caveats, right? So that's one I would be hesitant to say oh yeah, always, because I'm probably going to be wrong. But
so yeah, that's so that is also, I would say, I can answer that from experience. So when we have been called previously to ISVs, I had always the same approach to find those things, and that I cannot remember any case where that approach did not solve it then, where things looked ugly. And that does of course by no means that it is the way it works, but from experience I would say that is the approach that always lead to success.
So maybe I'm asking kind of questions that have already been answered, but just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, control invoke async can be called from any thread and effectively post to the UI thread. Is that true? Yes. And then show dialog async, can that be called from any thread, or does that have to be called on the UI thread?
That's a good question. I would actually ask the question. I mean, I would say yes, because I would say yes. I say yes, it does, not on purpose, but because if I use internally begin invoke to actually post the message. But right, I posted not for the reason primarily to marshal it back to the UI thread, but to queue it after the work that has already been queued. But as a side effect, it automatically gets delegated or marshaled rather to the UI thread. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, so I did hear that bit about how like even when you're on the UI thread, you might still want to use it to make sure you finish with like the current pass of work or what have you.
Yeah.
Or like the current rendering. But like, so maybe to just help complete my understanding, this is kind of where I was getting. Is there any difference between calling show dialog async versus calling invoke async with an action that calls show dialog?
I think the code looks pretty similar, but I think also we have in WinForms we have a special audience, and I think discoverability is a big thing. So for that reason, I don't know if that was the direction you were going.
It kind of was. Well, first I just wanted to know that it's the same thing, and it sounds like it is. But like, yeah, I mean, it might still make sense as an API for discoverability, like you said. I was just trying to make sure I knew what we were talking about.
I mean, there's certainly similarities. I don't have the complete code in my head right now. But yes, I mean, you would find in both begin invoke and task completion sources, and so yeah, I mean, it's like probably, I mean, yeah, you could also have the return value that is I think in the task dialog it's a button or something that you will be getting back. So you could do that with invoke async also. Yeah, I would say yes.
Thanks. Yeah.
So, or to answer it in a different way, there's no differentiation in invoke async, like main control.invoke required, and then I calling it directly else begin invoke. There's always the begin invoke, always in the invoke async.
So there might be some weirdness about trying to track modal state. So like, imagine you're moving the mouse over and there's a whole series of mouse moves, right? And if we pop in response to a mouse move, right, there's going to be more mouse moves that are going to be continuing to come in, right? So like, let's suppose you're doing pop-ups with your mouse move as you go across. Now that could continue to pop up additional things that are in theory modal, right? I don't know that that's a great practice, but like, I'm just trying to show some concrete example. Like, I don't know if we'll have to like track that we are modal and what we do with pending mouse moves and clicks and things.
I mean, the hovering and the focusing just via mouse moves works also when you are just show dialog with show dialog. So I don't know if there's really.
Well, you can't click on anything for sure, right? So
yes, that's true.
But like, there could be more clicks sitting in there that we would then pull through.
I think the nature shouldn't change if you call like a modal dialog with show async and or show dialog async and just show dialog.
Well, you're not processing those messages, right? So anyway, just something to think about when we go through there. We have to do a little bit of extra handling. There's a whole system for dealing with this, that like the IMSO thing, right? About like setting modal state in our pre-processing of stuff when you were hosting between different things, to try and replicate that when you don't actually have Windows doing that for you, right? So
I mean, effectively, in the case of show dialog async, the async part just defers the show dialog to a different point in time when
sure,
the message queue is empty. But in the nature of how it's handled, then shouldn't change anything, because then internally,
once it's up, yes, but like
until then, sure, yeah.
So it might be similar to this other mechanism. Like when you host a WinForms control inside of, I mean, this is historical. It's not really done much anymore. Matter of fact, we disable that by default now. But like if you're hosting a WinForms control inside of Office, at least in the old days, or in Visual Studio in the old days, we had to, if that WinForms control was intended to be modal, we had to communicate to VS or to Office that like the state is really supposed to be modal, so that they could actually change their behavior for plugins and the like. So I just want to mention that there might be some subtle complexity that we have to deal with there, where that's no longer happening directly. That may be okay, but the expectation from users may be that none of that stuff goes through as if it had like been popped right when you made the call.
I mean, finding out those subtleties is again why I would, I'm so keen to have it already in for .NET 9 as experimental, so we can really, collect those things and see.
Well, if this one intended to be experimental, like the dialogue one?
I would say yes, for the same reasons. I
think invoke async is like not a big deal, right? I think that one probably is not going to change. I think the dialogue one is the one where we might have a couple subtleties.
I mean, also it's RC1 where we not technically. Yeah, I would.
Sure, but both cases. But like, I feel stronger about the dialogue one. Like, being needing the experimental.
Yeah,
because of the time that it's going in.
Right, and invoke is already something that you can call from like a non-UI thread, right? Suppose it's just not async. So one thing I was, tell me if I'm wrong, but one thing that the reason I was asking about where you could call these methods before is because, if I understand correctly, the non-async show dialog you have to call on the UI thread, right? I would assume.
The non. Okay, can you say that again? I mean,
so Form already has show dialog overloads that basically match these async overloads. Yeah. Well, they're not, async, but you get the point. Async, non-async versions of these methods, which I assume you have to call on the UI thread. I was just wondering, is this a thing in WinForms? I'm not a WinForms expert, where you have async version that can be called from any thread and a non-async version that must be called on the UI thread?
No, because we're creating precedent, so to say, because there isn't really much WinForms specific async. I think there's none yet. So these are the first things that are really async WinForms specific. Always think there's a mechanism in WinForms where you can. So we have the principle in WinForms where we can't have cross-thread calls, because otherwise we're throwing the cross-thread call exception, I think it's called. Except we can disable it. And we can disable it still for performance reasons. So that was something that was, I think, back in the day was patched very lately before 2.0 shipped. if I remember correctly, and yes, I remember it, which is bad enough because I'm old. So the problem is with the cross-thread calls, checking that obviously takes performance, and the .NET 1.1 performance, like in a couple of cases, slowed so much down that people started complaining. And so there is a way to call that, to switch that off so that you no longer have that check. And so principally, you can call, or you can actually do manipulations from any other thread. But the idea behind it to call that off is that it would, at that time, it ran on one thread anyway. So, and if you guarantee as a application developer that everything runs on one thread anyway, then why should you want the checking, which costs time? But still, there are cases where you can do it and it succeeds, but you really need to do what you do. So just to be complete with from where can you call what? You could do it before if you wanted to, but it didn't automatically got marshaled to the UI thread. So if you, from two different threads, try to add items to a list view, for example, or to a list box, that may run 5 seconds and is okay, and then at the 6 seconds, the whole thing explodes. Or it may run 2 seconds before it explodes. What's sure is, if you run it long enough, it will explode at one point. You just don't know when. So that's how WinForms works and works until today.
So what I heard, so if we just go over this here for a second, so we said cancellation token we shouldn't take.
Yeah.
For this one, I aligned the method signatures with what the existing show dialog method is. You had one overload here that did not take a startup location in just a page. The other one doesn't have that.
So the problem is you cannot mix, for backwards compatibility reason. I think you cannot mix optional parameters and existing parameters, because then it says, hey, you have to decide if you do that or that.
So I mean, this is a new method group, right? So like the existing method group is show dialog, right? And these are the signatures that show dialog has. So that's.
I remember I did something like that. Maybe I screwed something up. I did something like that, and the compiler didn't let me do it.
I think this might have been something else. But if you look at the existing show dialog method, there's 3 overloads. One takes a page in a startup location, one takes a window a page in a startup location, and one takes an end-int a page in a startup location. Startup location is optional for all 3 of them, and it's defaulting to center owner.
Yeah, and the thing is that I think at the moment I had another optional parameter and at a different point than I don't know. There was
I think you probably mixed it with the cancellation token or something, but like that's. I'm pretty confident this signature here, this will work. And I guess that's also what you kind of want. You want the existing signature. If we had cancellation token, we would put cancellation token at the end and make it optional as well, which is which we don't want, but like that's what we would do.
I think that's okay.
The other thing is I marked them more like experimental. Like there's just a placeholder here, but just pick a number. For show async, I would probably say do whatever form does for show, and I think form doesn't have optional, right? They just have 2 overloads.
Yeah. For the owner and.
Are we not doing the invoke async?
No, that's on top. Like I want to refer that secondary. So you have show dialog. Yeah. You only have a show one that takes a window. That's right. And it's nullable, but it's not optional. So I guess that makes sense. That's probably. Arguably, you could probably change form and make it optional as well, because it seems desirable. But that's basically what we said. So then for invoke async, we said we want to get the cancellation token also in the callbacks. So the ones that are returning tasks, I added a cancellation token parameter to them. And the other thing is they're not experimental, so they basically have the signatures that they have.
Right. So why do these have a cancellation token as a formal overload instead of a defaulted parameter?
That's fair. We could just do that. So we do everywhere else.
Yeah.
I
And
like
then
that.
Mr. Tobe, for the funcs that yield tasks, should we be overloading on both accepting a cancellation token and not, or do you like the shape that's on the screen?
I generally prefer to just have the cancellation token be defaulted. Is that possible here?
In func?
In the funcs,
Oh,
you
it's
cannot.
inside the func.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was. No, isn't that? Oh, I see. Yeah, I was looking at the wrong. I was looking what was just on the screen a moment ago.
Yeah. So
so I would just always have it accept a cancellation token.
Okay, so you like what's on screen.
Yeah, you can always discard it with an underscore.
Yep.
In fact, it can actually be less characters because you're talking about an underscore instead of open paren, close paren. So
It's
Okay, I didn't know off the top of my head what patterns we used for async callbacks elsewhere.
we pretty much always have delegates like that accept the cancellation token. And if you don't want it, you just discard it.
I like that we're looking out for the code golfers. One character saved here.
Well, it's not about saying, it's just that often the
I
argument
know.
is, oh, but then I have to I have to add extra stuff. But in this case, it's actually less stuff. So
Yes. No, it was just funny.
Yeah.
I like it.
And there are instance methods that are not static. Is that also right?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So the only additional thing I would add is there was discussion before about performance actually being something someone might care about, in which case do you want to consider value tasks here?
Oh.
So, I mean, I assume with the window message, it's always gonna yield.
I don't know what the callback does. So
Oh, you mean the callback, the
like
overloading,
async
invoke
func
async,
returning a value task.
func of value task. Okay. If somebody screams, we can add it later.
Well, if these are experimental, we can change it later. But you couldn't easily overload on that delegates return type, because if someone's just using an async method,
Yeah.
I believe they're going to get an ambiguity error.
Yeah, at that point you would have to have a method and change the method probably.
You mean if they just wrote an async lambda?
Lambda, yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I
fair.
would-
So if we add it now, it would block an async lambda. If we add it later, it would break an async lambda.
So the big advantage would be for things that are like rarely async, but sometimes might immediately return a result. Because like if you could
Right.
always return a result synchronously, you'd use the sync overload, presumably.
Right.
Yeah. But like, yeah, maybe there's something that like every once in a while, like can't return a cache thing and has to do something async. Or,
I mean, is
I mean,
there,
I'm fine with it as is. This is a case where I would also be fine if I wouldn't blink an eyelash if that the expression if async func were typed to return value task. So I just wanted to ask.
I mean, there's really no downside, right? Because presumably this delegate is only ever going to be invoked from framework code, and so we don't really have to worry about usability hit, right?
I mean, it would be anytime anybody wants to have a callback fire on the UI thread via whatever special stuff control invoke async does.
No, I meant the delegate that is being passed in, right? The async func right now, right? The user is never awaiting that thing. The user awaits the
Right,
invoke
it's
async.
the invoke async that's awaiting it, which is why I'm not concerned about potential misuse, because
Right.
it's WinForms code that's consuming it.
That's what I'm saying. There really is no downside, right? Like, is there any downside to use value task here?
The only downside, the only meaningful downside would be if someone actually had a method typed as returning task and they wanted to pass that as a method group,
Oh,
that wouldn't compile.
Oh,
And if we overload it to take both, then they can't write
to
Basically.
Lambda.
invoke async, underscore arrow, whatever. So we have to pick which problem we care about more.
I mean, practically, I think the method group is less likely. So I
no,
guess.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Why?
I would actually. I think that the method group may be probably more likely.
Well,
Given that it would only bind a thing that it says, public, optional static, task, foo of cancellation token.
yeah,
Once it takes some other argument, you had to wrap it in a lambda to
yeah.
box in your parameters.
How often
to
would you
capture your
actually
parameters.
have something that takes no arguments? Like that I find hard to believe. I think this is almost exclusively a local lambda that closes over something.
So could you pass a task, wait all or when all or if any, or I mean,
Those
well,
all-
you couldn't.
Those will take arguments. We've had to wrap it in a lambda to capture the arguments.
Yeah.
If you had your own
True.
like
yeah.
task
No,
collection
no.
and you
Yeah.
wrote
Sorry.
wait all of
Okay.
cancellation
Yes,
token,
yes.
then that
Yes,
one
yes,
you
yes,
could
yes,
pass
yes.
by.
Yes.
by
Yes.
method
Yes. Sorry.
It also seems like we would not change the signatures here, right? I mean, we all agree the task here is the right thing, right? We're only talking about the task in here, right? Which, yeah, I think that's almost exclusively going to be a lambda, practically speaking, because you do something, right? You probably what you do is you want to update UI. So I think the most common thing you're closing over is some UI element that you want to update.
Yeah. I mean, I can believe a method group's being passed to the action one, assuming that we're leaving that one there. It's just anything that took no parameters.
I guess maybe, but that also doesn't matter. Yeah.
Unless action won't bind to things unless they're void returning.
That would be the case. They would have to return void. Yeah.
Okay, but if you have a public void show dialog paren, method group pass that to invoke async of action.
Yeah, you could. All right, so then I guess what I'm hearing is we do make this value task and value task of t.
So we're not overloading it, we're making it only value task.
Yeah.
And then chat has asked on the third line in this proposal, do we care that we have t as the generic type parameter when it's returning a task of t and t result when it's differently wrapped?
Yeah, we care. They should be the same.
Yeah.
I don't have a strong preference on whether it's T or T result.
I think t is fine given that it's the only thing that's in there. Are we cool with the names? I would probably just call them always func and call it good.
I'd just call them all callback.
Callback also works, yeah.
But
It's just async func and
what does
sync
control have invoke?
It does, yeah.
What did it call the thing it invoked?
Method. I guess that works
What-
too.
It would, yeah, and it was defined in 1998 probably.
Yeah, it was available since .NET Framework 1.0. So
I mean, WPF has the same. So what are they calling that?
well, what is it called? Framework element. No, it's the
No, it's the dispatcher.
dispatcher. Yeah, dispatcher dot invoke.
They called it callback.
Okay.
Let's call it callback then, because that's also like more modern. The other one takes delegate, which is probably not what we want anyway. So let's call this callback.
Invoke async of action takes callback, and invoke async of func of t result takes callback.
Yeah. All right. Sweet. Are we then cool with what's on screen right now? Let me hit comment so you can actually read it on your own screen, so I don't have to fit it in here.
Jules here became interesting when you say callback, because that's something that she doesn't really do well.
Sure.
Right? Oh, baby.
And we are cool with control being non-experimental, right? We're pretty confident about that API shape.
I think we're good on that one.
Okay.
Steve, you're the one who made reference to if it's experimental, we can change it later.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like,
That's true. Slap experimental on control, and we can change it in .NET 10. Love it.
well, I mean,
We'll call it.
I meant the
On the
method.
method.
On the method. I didn't mean the yes.
Oh,
Sorry.
I thought you were
Sorry.
talking about the class.
No, I meant the invoke async thing.
I still think it's fine. Like we kind of took the conservative approach, and as far as like if we're worried about people being concerned about perf going forward.
I think it's fine. We have invoke and begin invoke, right? Invoke async is just the natural,
Yeah,
squaring of the circle.
pretty much. Yeah.
But we trust WinForms developers, right? We should make invoke async return a value task and then reuse the source. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I'm happy with this.
Don't underestimate the WinForms audience.
I mean, honestly, it's one of those things where like I'm sure most people would be fine, but it's not worth it.
Sweet. Then everything's done then.
Yay.
Klaus, please tell me you don't come next week with another API proposal.
I promise you.
Okay. I'll hold you to it.
I know you will.
Jeremy, you also happy? You were very quiet.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, then we call it a day, and then I guess I see the rest of you on Thursday, so we can walk the remainder. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.